No, dummy, it's not like Catholics versus Protestants. In this episode of Satansplain and the one to follow it, we'll explore this notion of Satanism allegedly having different denominations. We'll see why this view is inaccurate, and what's really going on with all these so-called types of Satanism. We'll also see why gatekeeping the term Satanism is a wise and necessary thing, and the justification for Satanists like myself doing so.
Well, it's not Satan worship, it's Satanism. It's embracing the life-enriching things which have traditionally been given the devil's name. Pride, lust, earthly success, rational self-interest, atheism, humor, nonconformity, science, a passion for living, being selective about whom we love. We don't see these as shameful sins, but empowering ideals. And we also recognize the psychological power and fun of symbolism and aesthetics, so we utilize Satan as mythology's most fitting mascot for what we're about.
Satansplain, Satanic Talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M.
Magister Bill M here with Satansplain. This particular episode is long overdue, and that's mainly because it has been in the works for a long time. Some years ago, I published an article about the myth of satanic denominations. It was an article titled Only One Satanism, and it was printed in issue number 10 of The Devil's Diary, a publication by Reverend Draconis Blackthorn. I thought at first of just reading you that essay word for word on the show, but I decided instead to take the general idea and expand on it. Well, long story short, I ended up expanding it to about 3 or 4 episodes worth of material. But rather than talk to you for 4 hours straight, let's just take this one episode at a time. Well, we have a lot to get into, so to make this easier on you, the listener, I'm going to do what I usually do and leave timestamp marks in the full description of this Satansplain episode, so you can skip back and forth and pause and resume as you like. You'll no doubt hear some things you may have heard me say in previous Satansplain episodes, though I do encourage you to listen to the episodes in full at least once. Let us begin. I'd like to start by sharing 2 quotations. The first is from Anton LaVey's 1998 posthumous collection of essays, Satan Speaks. Quote, "The only person in recorded history to codify Satanism into an applicable religion is Anton Szandor LaVey." The second quotation comes from the opening sentence of an article titled The Satanic Bunko Sheet. Quote, "Because Anton LaVey made Satanism so popular, everyone wants to jump on the bandwagon." Now, I've chosen to open with those 2 lines because, as we'll see with this episode of Satansplain and its follow-up, they're not only true, but they both explain quite a lot. So what is Satanism? Well, I begin each and every episode of Satansplain with a pre-recorded 30-second answer to that question. Granted, it's not some sort of word-for-word official canonical answer to the question, but it's how I would answer it in my own words. I think it's good for adherents of any religion or ideology, really, to be able to give at least a halfway decent description of what it is they believe. I mean, how often we have seen people espousing some particular religion or ideology, or for that matter, protesting some activist cause, and when asked a couple simple questions about what it means or why they're saying what they're saying, they suddenly can't answer. Now, this can happen to any of us, really, particularly when you get so passionately into something that you let the passion run too far ahead of thinking and are only surrounded by people who understand the topic. But why should I have to describe what Satanism is at the beginning of every episode of Satansplain? I mean, after all, podcasts on other topics typically don't have to do that. If a podcast is about basketball, for example, I doubt the podcast hosts have to give a quick explanation of how the game is played, because they understandably presume that anybody who would want to tune into a basketball podcast would already know how the game is played. Nobody calls into a basketball radio show to ask questions about pruning trees or tuning pianos and get upset when they're told that these things have nothing to do with basketball. Unfortunately, when it comes to Satanism, it can seemingly reach those levels of ignorance. That's because there's quite a lot of misinformation out there on Satanism. Not just from Christian propaganda, but also the news media, entertainment industry, and other people who like the name Satanism so much they decide to slap it on something it's not. maybe even deriving their misinformation directly from one of those other sources I listed. So, while obviously you can't expect to learn everything about a topic by hearing a 30-second synopsis of it, I still think it's good to just have that practical description of Satanism in my own words, because after all, it's hard to have a conversation on any topic or otherwise convey information on it without some mutual understanding of what that topic is in the first place. That alone, I would say, is a justifiable reason for me to gatekeep the terminology of my religion. Gatekeeping being a very popular word these days used by people. We'll talk more about that later. So it's the practicality of having a vocabulary to work with. Now, on top of that, some of the misinformation on Satanism can reach levels where people are driven to such paranoia they want to see Satanism eliminated from the earth. They want to see all Satanists exposed, stripped of their rights as citizens, harassed, or worse. We saw a lot of that in the 1980s during the Satanic Panic hysteria. Obviously, we chose the name Satanism knowing that it elicits some controversy, but that's still no justification for lies about us. As I've said before in Satansplain, when you misrepresent my religion, you misrepresent me. Therefore, I feel I'm certainly in my right to call out egregious misuses of the name of my religion of choice. And to be clear, Satanism is indeed a religion. I take no shame in referring to my religion as a religion. Even the Satanic Bible refers to Satanism many times as a religion. And like all religions, Satanism has some defining dogma or doctrine. There's also ceremony and symbolism and a written ethics code. And when you combine all these sorts of elements, you get a particular religion. Now, you notice if you do listen to my 30-second description, one of the many things I list is atheism. That is a part of Satanism. Atheism means absolutely nothing more than not having a belief in the existence of any deities, any gods or goddesses. That's all the word atheism means. It doesn't necessarily mean no religion, but some try to argue that because one of the many traits of Satanism is atheism, that this trait excludes Satanism from being a religion. And this is incorrect. Belief in a deity is not, in fact, a requirement of a religion. We know this because there are plenty of other examples of non-theistic religions in the world. There's Jainism, Taoism, Theravada Buddhism, Raelianism, and so on. Satanism is also an example of a non-theistic religion. For that matter, there are people who don't subscribe to a particular religion, but certainly are not atheists either. I talked about all this stuff much more extensively back in Satansplain episode number 16, but I felt this point was worth repeating for this episode. Having said that, let us dive in. Now, the topic of gatekeeping, to use the popular buzzword, brings me to the title of this particular Satansplain episode. You see, there are times when I'll be in some discussion about Satanism or reading a supposed article or other media piece about a supposed Satanist, and what I end up seeing is quite simply misinformation about Satanism. Satanists like myself may then speak up and say, "No, what you said there is incorrect. Those things you just described as being Satanism are not in fact Satanism. They are not part of our religion. You posted a news article about a supposed Satanist, but notice the article says he believes in this thing and went on to do that thing, which is actually condemned in Satanism if you look here and here. We are Satanists and we reject what that person is doing." And quite often, in response, I'll hear knee-jerk reactions like the following.
"Bill, what gives you the right to say what Satanism is and isn't? Just because this thing isn't your type of Satanism doesn't mean it's not Satanism. You're a gatekeeper. This is like when Catholics say that Protestants are not true Christians, or when Protestants say that Catholics are not true Christians. That's a no true Scotsman fallacy. That's bigotry. That's religious fundamentalism." And then sometimes they'll try to further elaborate with lines like, "After all, Bill, all religions evolve, and I know there are different kinds of Satanism because it says so on Wikipedia. There's LaVeyan Satanism and theistic Satanism and traditional Satanism and modern Satanism and Buddhist Satanism and pink Satanism and decaffeinated Satanism and whole wheat Satanism and yeah,
sometimes they will go even further than this. They'll say,
Bill, why do you care what other people believe? I have the freedom of religion. You can't tell anybody what to think. In fact, caring about what other people think is unsatanic, because Satanism is all about not giving a fuck about rules or what other people think.
And then some go even further than that, and they say,
Satanism can be anything I want it to be. In fact, by not following your rules, I'm actually being more satanic than you. After all, that's what Anton would have wanted. I've never met him, and he died before I was even born, but I know. And that's why I am the high priest of the new satanic organization I founded, the Greater Mosque of Beelzebub Reformed.
Okay, all right, enough of my parody voice. You get the point. If you're a Satanist, you have probably heard some of these same things before. In fact, there's a chance that if you're listening to this episode long after it first aired, you may have been given a link to this episode as a response because you said one of those lines I just gave. Maybe even explicitly using the Catholics versus Protestants comparison. Perhaps you didn't listen to this episode at all after being given the link, and you're commenting on it, though, making more responses that are addressed in this recording, without even listening to it. Well, there's a lot to unpack in those lines that I rattled off in my sarcastic voice, so we're going to spend this episode unpacking them. First, since I know that some of the people who need to hear this episode will take a look at its length and say they don't have time for it, here is an attempted summary of the points I'm going to cover in this episode and the one or two episodes that will follow it. First of all, there really are no different denominations of Satanism, and this is not a case of religious fundamentalism on my part, nor is it a no true Scotsman fallacy. The various organizations in the world claiming to be Satanists, or claiming to be practicing some particular denomination of Satanism, or maybe being accused of practicing Satanism, are not in fact religious denominations in the understood sense of that term. It's not like what we see with major religions of the world, where Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and so on, each spread out over the course of history to have different denominations of their own, practicing the same religion, but just in a different way with a different interpretation, like you see with Christian denominations such as Catholicism and Protestantism. No, as we'll see, when you examine these so-called different types of Satanism closer, you will find that they all fall into one of the following three categories. 1, people who don't even identify as Satanists in the first place, but are just being called Satanists, whether that's by paranoid Christians, the tabloid media, or pop culture like horror movies and spooky documentaries. 2, people who do identify as Satanists and, like myself, are using a definition of Satanism that traces back ultimately to Anton Szandor LaVey and the Church of Satan, which was the first known group in history to have an actual comprehensively developed religion calling itself Satanism. And finally, the people I would put into category 3 are the people who do call themselves Satanists, but whose definition of Satanism comes from some entirely different place. In many cases, it traces back to some of those same examples from number 1, tracing back to a set of beliefs and practices that ironically originate with Christian scare propaganda, or copied from the tabloids, or from pop culture like horror movies and heavy metal gimmicks, or some combination of these sorts of things. These people's beliefs and practices don't really match Satanism at all, but they confusingly try to rationalize their use of our religion's label because they like the word Satanism. The one additional example of people which fall into either the category 2 or 3 are the so-called denominations of Satanism whose believers more or less do claim to be based on what Anton LaVey established, but upon closer examination, the thing they're doing doesn't really have anything new to offer, or something that members of the Church of Satan themselves are already free to do if they like, or in some cases, it's something set up by somebody who just can't read. The bottom line being, they're either trying to throw out things very fundamental to Satanism because they don't understand them, or they don't realize it's tied in with the rest of Satanism, in which case they can't really be considered a denomination. They're too fundamentally different. Or the differences they have are ultimately so inconsequential that most Satanists really don't care. It's something you're already allowed to do in Satanism, and it simply doesn't warrant having to create a whole new organization or denomination of Satanism. Quite frankly, a lot of these so-called satanic organizations, or people claiming to have created a new version of Satanism, are just narcissists that nobody likes, and they just own a website to call themselves the high priest of something. An additional thing I want to cover was a deeper dive into the underlying mentality that makes people recite those sorts of lines I rattled off earlier in my parody voice. Oh, you're a gatekeeper. Oh, this is just like Catholics versus Protestants, and so on. Most especially the claims that Satanism can be anything the person wants it to be, to the point where they see definitions as some kind of personal threat to their liberty. People who possess a certain postmodern mentality, if you will, of confusing structure for conformity and solipsism for personal liberty. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to cover that in this episode. So with all of that said, let's get back to my first point. I said that it's true that there are seemingly many different groups of people being referred to as Satanists, and their practices referred to as Satanism. Whether they decidedly are using the label themselves, or just have it placed on them. Let's take a closer look to see who this includes, and why, I would argue, there is no reason to consider them all to be different denominations of the same religion, that religion being Satanism. Let me start with what's probably the most outrageous case. I have seen some Christians who use the word Satanism to describe any sort of pagan or occult religion. I have seen Christians who extend that to groups that aren't even religions, but say have spooky practices that involve robes and candles, whether it's the Freemasons or secretive honor societies for college students like Skull and Bones. You can hear Satansplain episode number 26 for more on those kind of groups. And I've seen some Christians who take it even further than that, and they describe just about any person or anything they happen to dislike as Satanism. Political positions, homosexuality, popular fads, you name it. I've even seen Christians who accuse other Christians of being Satanists if they don't practice Christianity in the same way. So the Christians using the term Satanism essentially to believe that everything bad comes from Satan, so therefore anything bad they see can be dismissed as quote-unquote Satanism. But it's not just Christians who are throwing the labels of Satanism or Satanist on different things. There have been horror movies, for example, that will show people doing devil worship and animal sacrifice and other things which do not match that 30-second Satansplain description of Satanism at all. And yet in the movie we're told that these people are Satanists. There have likewise been tabloid news stories about a serial killer or a child murderer, and the writers will describe the criminal as a Satanist. And these heinous acts of his were all specific things that his religion of Satanism required, even though, once again, these acts include things not condoned at all in the Satanic Bible, and sometimes even explicitly condemned in the Satanic Bible. And it gets more and more confusing from there. We see people who call themselves Satanists, but once again are clearly using the term Satanism to describe something entirely different than what Satanists like myself or regular listeners of Satansplain understand Satanism to be. They may be what are more accurately and traditionally called devil worshippers, people who are not atheists like me, but rather believe in and revere Satan as a literal supernatural deity. And they include people who couldn't really tell you what it is they believe, but they're heavy metal fans or political activists, and they just like the idea of calling themselves a Satanist. Maybe they've haphazardly picked up ideas they saw being called Satanism, and they like the reaction it gets, and they tried throwing that mishmash together. Now, all of these people I've been describing for the past minute or so, are they all Satanists? I would say no. And I think most reasonable people would also say no. Satanism is a religion, and there really is no indication that all of these people I mentioned are practicing the same religion, even if you allow a lot of wiggle room for variations within the religion. We're going to take a break. When we get back, we're going to look more into this phenomenon of religious denominations, what that really means, and why it doesn't actually apply to what's going on in the examples I mentioned. Stay tuned. You are listening to Satansplain.
You are listening to Satansplain, real satanic talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M. For questions, comments, and correspondence, send an email to bill@satansplain.com.
Handmade, all-natural, botanical perfumes, soaps, and ceremonial incense, sculptures and jewelry to adorn yourself and your other altars. All this and more await you at moonandsunemporium.com. Ritual perfumes and other occult fine art luxuries, created and curated by me, Priestess Sarah Josephine Clark, with tarot readings by Reverend Dr. Dylan Clark. moonandsunemporium.com.
The Satanic Scriptures hands down the wit, wisdom, and diabolical perspective of the Church of Satan's High Priest, Magus Peter H. Gilmore. These essays, articles, and diatribes have been collected from over 20 years of the High Priest's writings for his infernal cabal, some first issued in the pages of publications available only to insiders. From the magic of toys to techniques of time travel, Magus Gilmore leads the reader down a left-hand path where few will find what they expect. Magus Gilmore reveals principles of satanic ritual in a frank discussion of forbidden rites. What is a satanic funeral? How do Satanists marry? Find out now, as these unholy ceremonies have never been disclosed outside of the Church of Satan's hellish hierarchy. Here is the philosophy for those bold enough to be their own gods or devils.
Visit thesatanicscriptures.com for more information. Released by Scapegoat Publishing. Available in paperback form from major booksellers and independents nationwide.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. Visit the main website for the show at satansplain.com. There you can find every episode of Satansplain. You can also listen to Satansplain on Spotify, YouTube, Audible, and a host of other places. If you are on social media, please give Satansplain a like and a follow, or whatever the equivalent is, on Facebook, X, and YouTube. For all questions and correspondence, you can email me directly. The email address is bill@satansplain.com. And if you enjoy Satansplain and would like to support the show, please go to the show's page on Locals. Point your web browsers to satansplain.locals.com. You can sign up for Locals for free, but you can also additionally become a paid subscriber there. We also have a merch store. You can go to that store on store.satansplain.com. And thank you, as always, for those of you who support the show in one way or another. Let's get back to the title of this episode and talk more about this phenomenon of religious denominations. Like I said, the major religions of the world have different denominations within them. Islam has denominations such as the Shiites and Sunnis. Judaism has the Orthodox and Reform. Buddhism has Theravada and Mahayana. And Christianity, of course, has not only Catholics and Protestants, but hundreds, if not thousands more. Methodists, Mormons, Pentecostals, Presbyterians, Jesuits, the Christian Science of Mary Baker, the Quakers, the Shakers, the Candlestick Makers. So, what does it mean to be a denomination within a particular religion? Let's look at the Catholics versus Protestants example. There are certainly some religious differences between these two groups. They have different interpretations of the Holy Bible, which leads them to have different thoughts about whether ministers should be able to get married, what exactly do concepts like salvation or grace mean, how does the Virgin Mary fit into all of this, and so on. But when you compare them, the Catholics and Protestants, to all of the other religions in the world on the whole, Protestants and Catholics have way more fundamental similarities than differences. They have the same holy book, more or less. They're both monotheists. They believe in one God, the God of the Bible. They believe Jesus is the Son of God. They both ultimately focus their religious beliefs on the alleged life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ as described in the Gospels. In short, Protestants and Catholics both share the same core beliefs, which distinguish Christianity from the rest of the world's religions. That's why they are both Christians. They are just both Christians of different denominations within Christianity. And notice also that the Protestant Reformation did not happen in the lifetime of the first Christians. The Catholic Church had been around for centuries. The world changed with the coming of the printing press and the ability for the individual to be able to read the Bible for themselves. But they were also using a book where different Christians and scholars to this day argue about which verses are to be taken literally, which verses are completely allegory, which translation is more accurate. In short, there's certainly a lot open to interpretation when it comes to the Bible. I rattled off a bunch of other denominations of Christianity, and the numbers of those really took off in the United States later on. So here's a country that has no official state religion, but whose predominant religion is Christianity, and gives you the freedom to start a church about anything you want. They'll even grant you a tax break for it. So not surprisingly, a lot of denominations of Christianity have been formed in the United States in the past couple of centuries. And this is an important point, and I will mention why later. Regardless, from Pentecostal snake handlers to Southern Baptists dunking themselves in the river, it's still a case of denominations of the same religion, not different religions. So, now that we have some working idea of what a religion is and how to reasonably identify two different practices as being two different denominations of the same religion, here's the big question. Can we say the same sort of thing about all of these so-called satanic groups? Are they really simply just denominations of the same religion? The short answer is no, they are not. To see why, let's go back to the examples I listed earlier of people who get referred to as Satanists or are likewise said to be practicing Satanism. First of all, I think we can reasonably eliminate the people who don't even call themselves Satanists in the first place. We shouldn't even be considering them. I don't care, in this case, about some conspiracy theorist who calls Hillary Clinton a Satanist, calls the Pope a Satanist, or calls some drag queen show at the Olympics a satanic ritual, or uses Satanism as an umbrella term to describe any and all witchcraft or occult groups. I don't give any credibility to a tabloid journalist who calls a serial killer a Satanist only because the police found a heavy metal album in his apartment. You can't tell me that these are all just different types of Satanism than mine, let alone in the same way that Protestants and Catholics and Methodists and so on are all Christians. Because when you try to lump all those sorts of examples I mentioned as types of Satanists, you're not even describing religious denominations at that point. You're just carelessly using the term Satanist as a pejorative to either feel more righteous or to sell more news or so that you don't have to think about things. But otherwise, what about some of these other so-called satanic groups? Are these all just different denominations of the same religion, that religion being Satanism? And as a member of the Church of Satan myself, am I simply no more or less of a Satanist than all of these others? Well, to help answer these questions, let's break these groups down into the ones from before 1966 and the ones after 1966, because the Church of Satan was formed right in the year 1966. I think we're going to have to save the post-1966 examples for the next episode of Satansplain, so let's start with the alleged Satanism before 1966. Now, before 1966, do we find any groups or individuals who, let's say, reportedly praised Satan in some sort of way? Again, I'm not talking about the Christian zealot view that says if you do something that's a sin in Christianity, you're somehow in league with Satan, whether you know it or not, and therefore what you're practicing is Satanism. No, what I mean is, are there people before 1966 who allegedly praised Satan in a very explicit way? The short answer is yes, and the Church of Satan is not ignorant of that fact. Right in the Satanic Bible, Anton LaVey himself goes into some detail about various groups or people before the Church of Satan said to be doing the devil's work. He talks about the Templars, Madame Guyon, Lavoisin, Sir Francis Dashwood, also people who would perform a piece of theatrical blasphemy known as the Black Mass. And then later in the 1800s, the white witchcraft people and the so-called experts of the dark arts like Eliphas Levi, and later occult groups like the Golden Dawn and mystics like Aleister Crowley or Rasputin. These are not, however, all cases of people practicing the same religion in just a slightly different way, and I will explain why in a moment. I want to just quickly talk about something called the duck test. Some people will skim over the examples like the ones I listed, Aleister Crowley, Sir Francis Dashwood, and so on, and jump to the conclusion, oh, they must have all been Satanists. And it's obvious because, hey, if it walks like a duck, and looks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then, you know, LOL. So this is a cliche known as the duck test. You may have heard it before, usually in other contexts. I've heard some Christians say this in recent years whenever, for example, some celebrity or music artist shows up at an award show wearing a red jacket or plastic devil horns, or some other gimmick to get people to pay attention to these TV events nobody watches anymore. Apparently the gimmick works, but I digress. The duck test can be a good antidote to the classic problem of not seeing the forest for the trees. However, it's not the most reliable way to understand what a particular religion is, or identify a particular practitioner of that religion. It may work with religions that have some kind of explicit dress code, like Hasidic Judaism or Islam. So if you see a woman dressed in a full hijab and all that garb and speaking Arabic, yeah, it would be a good educational guess to say she's a Muslim. I would put money on that. But even then, there are millions of women who would say their religion is Islam, but don't wear that clothing. They don't follow the dress code and so on. So regardless, the duck test only works if you know what to look for in the first place. In this case, that you know what traits a Satanist and Satanism would have. Well, that begs the question of what those traits are and why it's those traits and not others. First of all, Satanism is not a religion with a particular dress code. We have some guidelines when it comes to satanic ritual and what to wear there, but for day-to-day life, there is no dress code in satanic doctrine. Also, when it comes to looks, well, there are plenty of people who use some sort of eccentric or even devilish aesthetic, yet they aren't Satanists. There are lots of people out there who, for example, wear heavy metal shirts and pentagram necklaces, things stereotypical of the Satanist, I guess, but they would tell you themselves they're not Satanists. And for that matter, there are a lot of Satanists whom you would never guess are Satanists by looking at them, as we don't fit those sorts of stereotypes. So the duck test doesn't really tell us anything. I just wanted to address that before we move on. Getting back to the various people and groups I mentioned from before 1966, let's examine them deeper and ask this. Did any of them call themselves Satanists? Did any of them establish an actual religion called Satanism? Or if they did establish a religion and just called it something else, does that something else have enough in common with the Satanic Bible and the Church of Satan, theologically and philosophically, that both them and myself can be called different denominations of the same religion? Well, I don't see any evidence of that. And some may say, well, Bill, you all praise the devil. You venerate the devil, so that's what you all have in common. Therefore, you're all Satanists. Well, not all of those groups and people I listed do that. But even if they did, that alone doesn't describe a religion. There are heavy metal fans that praise the devil. There are South Park episodes that praise the devil, but that still doesn't define a religion. For that matter, you can find two people who each claim to praise God, but their similarities might end there, and they can be from two completely different religions. And likewise, some people will say, well, you're all Satanists because you all hate Christians, and you base all of your beliefs on denying Christianity. Well, first of all, that's not true. As I've pointed out before, Satanism is not simply taking Christianity and doing the opposite. Also, if you look at the 9 Satanic Statements, for example, they are philosophically just as anti-Buddhist or anti-Muslim as they are anti-Christian. Furthermore, there are people who have blasted Christianity, but once again are not practicing something that could be described as a religion, let alone the same one as mine. In fact, even if we leave out the Church of Satan for a moment and just look at these other groups and people I mentioned, Golden Dawn, the Hellfire Club, Madame Guyon, and so on, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of consistency on what they did or believed, aside from doing something that is blasphemous in the eyes of Christians, or in some cases just being accused of blasphemy. Again, that doesn't define a religion. People like the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley certainly established religions, but not something close enough to mine that we could be called two different denominations of the same religion. And even in the case of the Black Mass, it's hard to say when it went from being a propaganda piece of Christians to people unironically copying it and performing it for the sake of blasphemy. If we look at the Hellfire Club, for example, and similar ones from the time of Sir Francis Dashwood or Benjamin Franklin, we do see fraternal organizations for aristocrats who liked using the Black Mass as a good excuse for an orgy. But you need more than theatrical blasphemy to define a religion, and that's not what they invented. So once again, it's a case of Christians throwing the word Satanism on a bunch of other unrelated people or different belief systems, not a case of people practicing the same religion and then just putting their own spin on it to make a new denomination. Before we move on to take a look at the various so-called satanic organizations that have come and gone after the Church of Satan, that's going to be in the next episode, let's stop for a moment and look at what Anton LaVey did in 1966. To go back to one of the two quotes I gave at the beginning of this episode, LaVey was the first to codify Satanism into an applicable religion. By the way, there are two different pronunciations of the word, codify and codify. You'll hear one more in US English and one more in UK English, so it's just a matter of dialect. But that word, nonetheless, is very important, as we'll see in a moment. I talked earlier about Christians who throw the term Satanism carelessly on anything they don't understand or don't like. And to be fair, that is where the term originally came from. The word Satanism, notably with the lowercase s, was coined for that purpose. We even hear it used in the 1930s film, The Black Cat, which is right on the Church of Satan suggested film list, to describe a bunch of devil worshippers that are in the movie. But even then, the characters are doing a bunch of things that, for the most part, just seem to have been written for the movie, like preserving people in hibernation and reading a book called The Rites of Lucifer. I don't see evidence of an established religion called Satanism doing these things before that movie existed, let alone before the Church of Satan existed. Regardless, nobody at the Church of Satan is claiming to have invented the word, the grammatical word itself, Satanism. So if you're one of the idiots who is reading the title of this video and think that that's your big counter-argument, well, too bad. Nobody's saying that. But again, even when the word Satanism existed, notice it was only used as a pejorative. So that means it was a word used to scorn and dismiss something as bad. It's like the term conspiracy theorist, for example. The term conspiracy theorist is a pejorative. That's because conspiracy theorists never call themselves conspiracy theorists. It's a derogatory term. It's an insult only used to describe other people. Now, sometimes, however, pejoratives become reappropriated and taken up pridefully in a sort of ironically fun and defiant way. So, for example, look at the word geek. A geek used to refer to some freak you'd see biting heads off chickens at a carnival, and the word later grew to become an insult to describe any nerdy person, an egghead, an outcast, or a socially awkward person with a crazy hobby. But nowadays, you see many people using the term as sort of sarcastically, as a point of pride. You'll hear somebody say, "Yeah, man, I'm a video game geek," or "Yeah, I'm a total Star Wars geek, man. Look at I have every movie on every video format ever released." I even had a delivery today from Best Buy We ordered something and they delivered it, and what pulls up but a big truck called the Geek Squad. The word dyke is another example. It's a slur word used against lesbians, but now you have some lesbian groups who have turned that around and use it proudly, like the lesbian motorcycle club, Dykes on Bikes. So Anton LaVey did this same sort of thing with the pejoratives Satanist and Satanism. Again, those words were pejoratives before Anton LaVey established the Church of Satan. The reason why he chose that term and why it's an apt one, well, that's something I answer in that 30-second introduction to Satansplain. But Anton LaVey took it even further than that. He took the word Satanism beyond meaning a pejorative, and he codified a new religion with that name, meaning he created something that is actually organized, something structured, something defined, not something limited to blasphemous ceremony or limited to some vague sentiment like, go out and be a sinner, or go out and be a hedonist, or the only rule is there are no rules. Those are just meaningless kind of platitudes. No, Satanism is a religion with its principles written out. It has a spelled out philosophy which you can live by and apply to day-to-day life, and additionally has rituals and symbols which integrate with all of that. Like I said, there is seemingly no evidence of an actual developed religion calling itself Satanism before Anton LaVey. There are non-Satanists being branded as heretics. There were scare stories about heretics. There are occasional people styling themselves after the stories of heretics. As LaVey says in the Satanic Bible, paraphrasing, a closer look at these pseudo-Satanists of past centuries shows not an actual religion called Satanism, but people who were the victims of more elaborate propaganda. And I'm going to stop right there for now. In the next episode of Satansplain, I'll be picking up right where we left off, exploring allegedly satanic groups from after 1966, and whether they could be considered denominations of the same religion, if they really offer anything different, the motives in making them, why there seem to be so many, and if there's really any need for them. Thank you for listening. Until next time, hail Satan.
You have been listening to Satansplain. For more information about the show, visit the official website at satansplain.com. And for more information on Satanism itself, visit churchofsatan.com. This episode is copyright 2024, Magister Bill M.